to ditch your Minnesota residency? Can't I just spend more than half the year outside of Minnesota and I should be good, right? This is a common question I get from clients. Hi, I'm Claire Langton-Yanowitz from the Yanowitz Law Firm, where we've been helping clients with wills, trusts, and probate for the last 29 years. We help people protect what matters most. A common question people have, if I spend more than half the year somewhere else, do I need to file Minnesota income taxes? Am I considered a Minnesota resident? The answer to that is maybe. There are two different tests that you have to run yourself through in order to determine if you're a Minnesota resident. The first test is a 183-day rule. If you spend more than 183 days in Minnesota, you're a Minnesota resident, okay? There's no question about it. You are a Minnesota resident if you spend more than half the year here, okay? And that includes partial days. So, you're here in the morning and then you took a plane to Florida, and the other half of the day, they don't get into partial days, in that. You're here part of the day, it's a full day in Minnesota, unless you are at a layover in Minneapolis for part of a day. So you fly from New York, you lay over in Minneapolis, and then you go to LA later in the day. That would not be counted towards your 183 days, but that doesn't really happen very much for people. So if you're here more than half the year, you're a Minnesota resident. But what if you aren't here more than half the year? A lot of times people say, well, in that case, I'm not a Minnesota resident. Unfortunately, the rule is not so black and white. You have to run yourself through the domicile test in order to determine if you're a resident, if you're here less than half the year. So right now I've shared my screen with you, which talks about the domicile test for Minnesota residents. So if you're here less than half the year, then you have to look through all these different variables to determine whether you're a Minnesota resident. However, the variables listed here are not exhaustive. They say that these are for guidance purposes, but there could be more variables to consider to determine whether you are a Minnesota resident. So it's important to run through these variables. So where do you spend the majority of your time? Okay, so maybe you're in Minnesota less than half the year. Maybe you're here 5 months, but then the rest of the year, you split your time equally between 3 other states. So proportionately, you spend more time in Minnesota than you do elsewhere. The location of your spouse, children, dependents, and other relationships is another factor. Location of keepsakes, memberships, clubs, and organizations. Where do you attend church? Not just where are you a member of church, but where do you actually go to church? Where do your family members attend school? Face-to-face or online, whether you pay resident or non-resident tuition. So those are factors they looked into. They look into what states you have your professional license, where you're a union member, location of employment, permanent and temporary, the location of real estate and personal property. So where do you have your car stored? They'll also look at the business relationships with housing. They'll look at the location of newly acquired living quarters. So you buy a home in Arizona, and what's the status of your former living quarters? Is your house in Minnesota vacant? Are you renting it out? Are you actively trying to sell it? The size and value of the residence. This one's a big one because people will often have their larger Minnesota home, and then they'll have, a smaller home in Florida or Arizona, maybe even a trailer home in those places. So their home in Minnesota is much bigger than the home that they've bought somewhere else. Address change notifications, the location of your domicile of prior years. Once you've become a Minnesota resident, the presumption is that you stay a Minnesota resident until you take action to not be a Minnesota resident. Where is your driver's license issued? Voting registration, and where do you vote? Where do financial transactions occur? Most people pay for things with their credit card right now. So you can track where people are depending upon where those payments occur. Address for military records, address on legal documents, statements to insurance companies, where even resident or non-resident hunting and fishing license in Minnesota, location of jury duty, and then there's some spousal presumptions. You generally have the same domicile as your spouse unless you're legally separated or divorced. So if you and your spouse are living in different states, you could have a different domicile, but the overriding presumption is that you're going to be domiciled in the same state. Those are all things to consider. Now, if you're trying to acquire the residency of a different state, they have whole other lists of requirements as well. So it's not uniform throughout the states. In Florida, it can be a lot easier to become a Florida resident than it is to lose your Minnesota residency. So this list here is only for determining your residency for Minnesota purposes. But if someone was trying to become a resident of another state, you would need to research what acts you need to go through in order to become a resident of that state as well. So stay tuned because this is a 3-part series. And in the 3rd part, we are going to talk about, even if you're not a Minnesota resident, you can still end up paying Minnesota estate tax if you own property here. And so we're going to explore that more in my 3rd part. Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about estate planning, wills, and trust, hit the subscribe button to our YouTube channel so you can get notified of when we add new movies to our channel. Thank you.